At some point, this became the question that runs underneath almost everything else in your marriage. Why? Why did things change? Why don't you feel the way you used to? Why can't you just tell me what happened, when it happened, what I did or didn't do that led us here? You've probably asked some version of this question more times than you can count. Sometimes gently, sometimes desperately. Sometimes in the middle of the night when neither of you can sleep. And every time you ask, some part of you believes that if you could just get the full, honest, complete explanation, something would finally settle. The confusion would lift. Maybe the pain would even become bearable, because at least it would make sense. But here's what you may have already started to notice, even if you haven't said it out loud yet. The explanations you do get never quite land the way you need them to. They're partial, or they contradict something said last week, or they leave you with 3 new questions for every one they answer. And each time that happens, you find yourself asking again, a little more urgently, hoping this time will be the time it finally clicks into place. If that's where you are right now, caught in a loop of chasing an answer that never fully arrives, I want you to know something before we go any further. Your need to understand isn't unreasonable, but the way you're pursuing it might be quietly working against you, pushing the person you're trying to understand further away instead of closer. I've talked with a lot of people caught in exactly this loop. Genuinely good, thoughtful people who just want to understand what happened to their marriage, and who keep circling back to the same unanswered question, hoping the next conversation will finally be the one that resolves it. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve a comforting oversimplification. I'm not going to tell you that wanting an explanation is wrong, or that you should just let it go and move on without understanding anything. What I am going to do is walk you through why chasing a full explanation often backfires, even when the desire behind it makes complete sense, and what a different relationship to that need for answers could actually look like. Not because there's one right way to make peace with uncertainty, but because you deserve to stop running the same loop over and over, hoping for a different result each time, when the pattern itself might be part of what's keeping you stuck. When someone gets stuck in this exact pattern, needing an explanation their spouse can't quite give, there are really only a handful of paths this tends to take from here. The first path is continuing to chase it, asking again in different words, in different moods, hoping persistence eventually produces the clarity that's been missing. The second path is the opposite, giving up on the question entirely, forcing yourself to stop asking, pretending the need for understanding has simply gone away, when really it's just gone underground. And the third path is something different from both, learning to hold the need for explanation more loosely, redirecting the energy it takes toward what's actually workable right now, without pretending you don't still wish you understood more than you do. I'm not going to tell you which path fits where you are. I can't know that from here. But I do want you to understand what tends to happen down each of these 3 roads, because most people caught in this loop only ever try the first, and when it doesn't produce relief, they assume they just haven't asked the right way yet, or the right number of times, or in the right tone, when the deeper issue usually isn't how the question is being asked at all. Let's start with why the need for an explanation feels so urgent in the first place, because I think it's more understandable than it feels from the inside. Human beings are built to make sense of things. When something painful happens without a clear cause, our minds tend to treat that absence of explanation as its own kind of threat, as if not knowing why is somehow more dangerous than knowing something difficult. Understanding, even painful understanding, feels like a form of control. If you can identify exactly what went wrong and when, some part of you believes you'll be able to prevent it, fix it, or at least brace for it properly. That instinct makes complete sense. The problem is, it assumes there's a clean, complete explanation waiting to be found. And in most marriages going through this kind of distance, that assumption isn't actually true. There's a specific kind of pain in not knowing why something happened, separate from the pain of the thing itself. Losing closeness with your spouse is painful on its own. Not understanding why it happened adds a second layer on top of that, a sense of disorientation, of not being able to trust your own read on the relationship, of feeling like the story of your marriage has a missing chapter you can't move past without. That second layer is often what's actually driving the repeated asking, more than the original loss itself. You're not just grieving the distance, you're grieving not having a story that makes sense of it. And that second grief can end up feeling even heavier than the first, because at least the first one has a shape you can recognize. And here's something worth sitting with, because it applies to almost every decision inside a pattern like this. Everything you do, or don't do, carries a short-term consequence and a long-term one. In the short term, asking again feels productive, like you're actively working toward resolution instead of just sitting in confusion. But the long-term consequence of repeatedly chasing an explanation your spouse can't fully give is that it tends to put them in a position where they're constantly being asked to produce something that may not exist in the clean, coherent form you're hoping for. Most people, including the ones going through their own emotional withdrawal, don't actually have full access to why they feel the way they feel. Feelings shift, contradict themselves, and resist tidy narration, which means every time you ask for the complete explanation, you're often asking for something your spouse genuinely cannot give you. Not because they're hiding it, but because it doesn't exist in the form you're looking for. I also want to name something that might be hard to hear, but I think it matters. Repeated requests for explanation can start to feel, from your spouse's side, less like curiosity and more like an interrogation, even when that's never your intention. Each time the question comes back around, especially if previous answers already felt inadequate, it can push your spouse further into a defensive posture, protecting themselves from a conversation that feels like it can't be won, rather than opening up further. The very thing you're chasing, in hopes of closing the distance, can end up widening it instead, simply because of how repeated pressure for an answer tends to land on the person being asked. This creates a particularly frustrating cycle, worth naming plainly. The more your spouse senses that no answer will be enough, the less motivated they become to try giving one at all, since any explanation they offer is likely to be met with more questions rather than acceptance. And the less they try, the more it can look, from your side, like they're withholding something on purpose, when often what's actually happening is that they've simply stopped believing any answer will land the way you need it to. So they've quietly stopped trying to find one, which then reads to you as evasion rather than exhaustion. Now, let's actually look at where each of these three paths tends to lead, starting with the first, continuing to chase the explanation, asking again in hopes that persistence produces clarity. In the short term, this feels active, like you're doing something about the confusion, instead of just sitting in it. But I want to be honest about the long-term consequence of that same choice. Repeated chasing tends to teach your spouse that no answer they give will ever be enough, which, paradoxically, makes them less likely to try giving one at all. I want to be fair to this path, though, because asking isn't the problem. Asking as a substitute for anything else is. There's a real difference between asking a genuine question once or twice, giving your spouse room to answer honestly, even imperfectly, and asking the same underlying question in 100 different forms, because no single answer has ever felt like enough. The first is normal, healthy communication. The second is a loop that rarely produces the peace it's actually chasing, no matter how many times it's repeated or how differently it's phrased. The second path, giving up on the question entirely, forcing the need for understanding underground, tends to feel like relief at first and heavier later. In the short term, not asking anymore can feel like maturity, like you're finally sparing both of you the exhausting cycle. But the long-term consequence of suppressing a genuine need to understand, rather than actually resolving your relationship to it, is that the unanswered question doesn't disappear. It just stops being spoken, and often gets replaced by private theories that are rarely kinder than the truth would have been. I think of a situation I've seen more than once, with the details changed, but the shape kept intentionally similar. Someone who stopped asking their spouse why the distance had grown, telling themselves they'd made peace with not knowing, but privately filled the silence with an assumption that they simply weren't lovable enough to be given a real answer. An assumption that took root quietly and grew heavier every week it went unspoken. That assumption, never spoken and never tested, did more damage over time than the original unanswered question ever had. Silence doesn't resolve the need for meaning. It just lets that need write its own story, usually a worse one than reality. Because in the absence of any actual information, the mind tends to fill the gap with the most self-critical explanation available, not the most accurate one. The third path, holding the need for explanation more loosely, without either chasing it endlessly or suppressing it completely, is the one that actually seems to help people move forward. This looks less like finding the perfect words to finally unlock a full explanation, and more like gradually shifting the central question of your conversations from, "Why did this happen?" toward, "What do we do now that it has?" I think of another situation, again with the details changed, but the shape kept intentionally similar. A couple who had spent months circling the same unanswered question, until one of them, exhausted, said something like, "I don't think I'm ever going to get the full explanation I've been asking for. Can we talk about where we go from here instead?" That sentence didn't magically resolve the hurt or make the unanswered part stop mattering. And there was real grief in saying it out loud, a kind of quiet surrender to not knowing everything. But it changed what the conversations were actually about, and for the first time in a while, they were talking about something they could both actually do something with. In the short term, letting go of the demand for a complete explanation can feel like giving something up, like accepting less than you deserve to know. But the long-term consequence tends to be conversations that actually move somewhere, instead of circling the same unanswered question in slightly different words every time. What made that shift possible wasn't a sudden loss of interest in the truth. It was a kind of exhausted honesty about what the endless asking was actually accomplishing, which was very little, other than keeping both of them stuck in the same painful conversation on repeat. Letting go of the demand for a complete explanation didn't mean the question stopped mattering. It just stopped being the only thing either of them was allowed to talk about. I know the need to understand what happened to your marriage is real, and only you know how long you've been chasing that explanation and how tired that chase has made you. I can't know that from here, and I wouldn't presume to. But if you want something that walks you through this more deeply, a way to actually work through what to do with an unanswered question instead of just circling it, I put together 3 step-by-step guides for every stage of a marriage crisis, including exactly this kind of moment. The Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy. It's linked in the first comment below, whenever you're ready to look at it. Now, let's keep going. Here's the part I really want you to sit with before we finish today. Not every situation resolves with a full explanation, and that isn't a failure on your part or proof that you haven't asked the right way yet. Sometimes the most honest answer available is an incomplete one, offered by someone who doesn't fully understand their own feelings either, and continuing to chase a cleaner answer than that often costs more than it gives back. It doesn't mean you stop wanting to understand. It just means the understanding you're able to reach might look different than the tidy explanation you originally hoped for. I'm not here to tell you to stop wanting to understand your own marriage. That's a completely reasonable thing to want, and it's your decision how much you keep asking, and how nobody outside of it, including me, gets to tell you when to stop wanting answers. But if you do want support thinking this through, a clear way to understand this pattern and what actually helps, instead of chasing or suppressing the question, that's exactly what the Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy was built for. It's not a lecture telling you to stop caring about the truth, and it's not a script telling you exactly what to say tonight. It's 3 guides that walk you through the pattern itself, one piece at a time, at whatever pace genuinely fits where you are, without pretending the need to understand simply disappears because someone tells you it should. It's linked in the first comment below. Take your time with it. Go look at it when you're actually ready. There's no rush on my end, and there shouldn't be on yours either. Before you go, I want to leave you with this. Wanting to understand what happened to your marriage isn't a flaw. And I don't want you to hear anything I've said today as a reason to stop caring about the truth of your own life. But there's a real difference between asking honestly and chasing endlessly. And the second one tends to cost more than it gives back, no matter how understandable the impulse behind it is. There isn't a universal right amount of explanation seeking, and I'd be lying if I told you there was one. What's right is going to depend on your history, your spouse, and how much peace you're actually able to make with an answer that may never be as complete as you want it to be. If any part of what I talked about today felt a little too familiar, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments the question you keep asking that never quite gets answered the way you need it to. The one you find yourself circling back to even when you promise yourself you won't. Not to be judged and not to be told to just move on by strangers on the internet. Just to be heard by other people quietly stuck in the same loop. Wherever you are in this tonight, you're allowed to want an explanation. And you're also allowed to stop needing a perfect one before you let yourself move forward. Both of those things can be true for you at the same time, even if it takes a while to actually feel that way.